Good afternoon. This is Dr. Craig Stern of Pharma Pharmaceutical Consultants and ProData Analytics. I'm delighted to have another chance to speak with you. Obviously, there's a significant amount of happiness as well as angst and all kinds of things after the election, and I was going to avoid it because I don't want to get involved in any political discussions, but I was convinced that we should talk about healthcare principles. And so I'm going to spend the next 10 minutes or so talking about healthcare principles and some of the issues that are applicable with regard to what's going on in healthcare today. I'm not taking a political position or otherwise. I want to talk about the uncertainty and some of the things going on. First of all, I want to talk about values. A couple of weeks ago, I talked about healthcare values, talked about the MUD rule with regard to treating patients who are in front of you regardless of the consequences, dealt with cost in the WIC line decision about what goes on with regard to cost as being on the table, but one of the last parameters on the table after cost effectiveness has been addressed, issues with regard to non-bias and issues with regard to consistency that we saw with the Jolene Fox issue. These principles have been around a long time. The oldest of them, the MUD rule, has been around for about 150 years, and the others have been around for 40 or 50 years. So there isn't an expectation or even a rationale that we would expect these kinds of things to change. So one of the things I do want to address is that healthcare principles in general are not something that's subject to a lot of discussion, and most of them are relatively intuitive and simple. The second thing is that there's been a significant amount of talk about drug cost, and we've talked about that in prior discussions as well. The news is all over that the pharmaceutical industry is happy that Trump is going to be the next president because they feel that they've been lifted from having to deal with cost control issues. Proposition 61 in California lost after presumably a drug company spent about $100 million in defeating it. I think there's a larger issue here, though, and the larger issue is that as costs are going up and people have to pay a greater share of the overall cost, there is a significant amount of concern about transparency, about how do you afford it, where does the cost control occur, and as I've talked about in prior ones, that there are other options that we need to have on the table. So it's not just about how can I make an $84,000 drug look like a $200 drug, which is never going to happen, and how do we go about addressing that? I think that the cost issue is not something where everybody should be standing up and cheering, because everyone is involved in it, irregardless of party or type, and everyone has a significant amount of interest in what goes on when they're paying the full cost of these things. Furthermore, while the election had to deal with nationalism versus internationalism, the pharmaceutical industry is an international industry. And as I've also talked about before, drugs are being manufactured and being sold across the world. These kind of issues are not going to go away. Price transparency is becoming more and more well known to everybody, whether they're drugs that are coming from Israel or Brazil or South Africa or China, India, or wherever. Bottom line is that these kind of things are of interest to everybody, and the transparency issue, price comparison issues are not going to go away, and everybody's going to be part of that argument and that discussion. I don't know that everybody will be able to just ignore it and say, well, now we can deal with this, and price concessions will be a problem. Now, there's a few things that have to deal with the Affordable Care Act, and clearly that has been a major issue with regard to discussion. It's been a major issue prior over the issue that people are concerned about premium price increases and what's going on with some health plans that have said that they won't participate or otherwise. Whatever happens with the Affordable Care Act, the question is, can it be entirely dismantled? And in order to do that, it's going to require that there's a supermajority, which the Republicans don't have. So one of the things that's going to be in discussion is, will it be entirely dismantled or partially dismantled? There's an expectation that Medicaid expansion will be dismantled for it, et cetera. But the still larger question is there's significant issues that have come up in these discussions. One is the Medicaid, Medicare expansion. How do you deal with that? No matter what the plan is, what do you do? And we have preciously few ideas about how, whether it's a Trump plan or anybody else's plan, how they're going to deal with it. There has been over 7 presidents that have tried to get healthcare laws, and that's of both Republicans and Democrats. So it's not a purely Republican, it's not a purely Democratic issue, but 7 different presidents tried to do this. So there's a lot of discussion at the level of president and Congress about how do you deal with this? How do you deal with people that are using emergency rooms, hospitals as their primary care vehicles rather than doctors? How do you deal with the limits to how much they can use, what the insurance companies are, whether insurance companies will now be targets or whether they'll be open and people will be able to use them. But it leads to the problem of how are they going to deal with expansion or non-expansion to Medicaid and Medicare in order to give more benefits to people. The second is, how do you deal with the younger people that have been a constant problem about giving them a flexible benefit that doesn't cost a fortune so that they'll join, because we're still fighting the law of large numbers, and that is to make these plans affordable, whatever the solution is. To make these plans affordable, you have to be able to offer a low-cost plan to people who are well and a higher cost plan to people who are not well. And you need to be able to subset the population so that people who don't need a lot of care don't pay very much and people who do need a lot of care pay more, but either way, so that there is a population that is more attuned to how people can participate, because when young people or an entire population doesn't participate, it does violate the law of large numbers. And what happens is the cost of premiums, the cost of care goes up because you're only treating the sicker people and not the people who don't really need care. And that's been not just a United States issue, it's been an issue everywhere, whether it's in Canada or Europe, Asia or otherwise. That's been a constant issue. The other issue is that the Affordable Care Act brought in treatment for people with pre-existing conditions. So depending on what goes on, it'll be interesting to see what happens to people who have pre-existing conditions who before the Affordable Care Act couldn't get insurance. Now they do have insurance. So there's about 20 million people, many of which had pre-existing conditions. And the question will be, what happens to them and how do you address that? And if there's a solid plan to address those issues. Finally is pharma, and that is, pharma is an international industry, as I've talked about, and more the overall cost of care is shifting to either primary care, where patients are taking the drugs and are using them at home or administering them at home if they're injectable, or going to the physician's office or an infusion center in order to get expensive injectable drugs. That's the specialty medications, biotechnology medications that are commonly discussed. Pharma, presumably stocks in pharma have improved dramatically because presumably there was a lift on cost as we started this conversation. But the larger question is going to be, where does pharma sit in all of healthcare? Right now, most of the cost of healthcare goes to hospitals and doctors. And now with the cost of drugs either equal to or greater than many hospital visits, that becomes a major concern, and people are paying a significant part of that. So we're dealing with international industries that have a lot of competition, that have a lot of benchmarks and what's going on in other parts of the world, how that industry and how that drug research and development is going on, a good deal of which is not happening in the United States, and how that is going to factor in, and how people are going to be looking at this and try and figure out, how do you deal with cost inflation? How do you deal with pharma and the biotechnology industry, and presume that the newer administration won't touch that and there won't be a confusion as to what you're going to do, or we leave it alone and then people are complaining about how they pay for drugs. I think with all of the uncertainty and everything going on, those are some main things that we probably want to look at, and we want to see how they're dealing with many of the risk adjustments in order to try and identify sicker people versus those who are not. But either way, there's going to be a lot of interesting things going on in healthcare, and a lot of people who were uncertain and were moving from a system where there was a volume to value, and a good deal of that healthcare has already started. About 50% of different plans are already participating in value-based contracting. So it'll be interesting to see how that happens, because they're basing it on quality ratings, 5-star quality ratings and others, in order to do that. Please feel free to dial into our www.profarmaconsultants.com/rxinfox.html for daily news that's coming through on pharma, on pharmacies, on issues with regard to healthcare, analytics, etc., evidence-based and critical appraisal of research, so that you can keep up with what's going on in the news. And clearly, if there's an interest, please feel free to respond to us and ask questions. We're always interested in doing so. We will talk to you next week. I wish you all a wonderful week, and please stay healthy. Be well.